What's up, storytellers? I'm C.R. Rowanson, the Magic Engineer, and it's time to talk about magic. In this video, I want to talk about some specific methods that we can employ in order to deliberately make hard magic systems. Now, I honestly can't tell you why it's taken me so long to do this video. I've wanted to do it for a long time. Fortunately, the wait is over and we can get into it, but first, we need to talk about a couple of definitions and provide some other information. First and foremost, we need to cover my definition of what I mean when I say hard magic. The reason for that is the definition I use is a bit different from what you might be familiar with, especially if you're really only familiar with Sanderson's laws of magic and how he talks about hard and soft magic systems. So for me, I think magic systems actually break down into two axes and not just one. So there is the rational and irrational spectrum, which is all about the reader or user's ability to extrapolate correctly from information that has been provided. Now, that's a big part of the difference between things like Superman and the Mistborn world and Allomancy and all of that. Hard and soft is all about the amount of information that is provided. If you want to know more about the types of magic, the differences between them, and how they can combine to give you interesting possibilities, you should definitely watch some of my other videos on the types of magic, and I'm definitely going to leave links and some video cards, so just click on those if you're not as familiar with the concept. Those two axes combine to create this grid that you see here, and the more generally used definition of hard and soft magic kind of runs in a diagonal across my grid, so that when people are talking about hard magic, like Sanderson's hard magic, they're really talking about hard rational. I want to get into specifically the difference between a hard magic system and a soft magic system the way I look at it. And the main difference there is the percentage of the system that is known or understood. In most cases, known or understood by the readers, could be known or understood by the magic users. Either case, it's how much is known or understood. Personally, because of my engineering brain, I kind of break it down into percentages. If we make a list of all of the magical effects that can be produced with the magic, the specific rules they need to know, specific patterns, specific limitations, specific restrictions, all of the distinct pieces of information that there is to learn about this magic system, and list them out in a numbered list, how many of those are going to be communicated? If more than half of them are communicated, then you kind of tip over the middle of the spectrum into hard magic. If less than that is being communicated, it's softer magic. So hard magic is all about communicating the majority of the system to your readers, or having the majority of the system known by your magic users. In most cases, we're primarily focused in how the readers feel about it in terms of hard and soft. Before we get into the details of how to create a hard magic system, let's talk about why you would want a hard magic system. One reason you might want hard magic is directly related to Sanderson's first law of magic, which is the author's ability to provide satisfactory solutions to problems is directly correlated to the reader's understanding of said magic. And that sums it up. Really, and I'm pretty sure I've talked about this before somewhere, that law is basically a law of foreshadowing. If you have a big plot problem that people have been dealing with for any length of time, and you have dedicated any kind of narrative screen time to it, it needs to have a satisfying conclusion, and you can't get that from something that just comes out of left field, especially if it's not one of the major conflicts of the story. If it's the main focus and a random ability that we've never seen just solves the problem, that sucks. Now, if you lampshaded this or you highlighted it in the beginning, foreshadowing, you can now use that as your solution. It doesn't necessarily have to be rational. It doesn't have to be a clever twist of logic or anything like that. We just need to know that it is there before they use it. And that's it. So if you want to solve plot problems, and you want to solve a lot of plot problems with your magic, a harder magic system might be the way to go. Hard magic systems can also do a lot for your setting and your characters. Hard magic in a setting often makes the world itself feel like it is more complete and more explored and just better understood. Because if the characters and the people in this world understand this esoteric concept to this degree, it kind of builds this automatic assumption that they understand other parts of this world to the same degree. So the world itself is developed and explored. It's kind of a cheap trick you can use with writing in general. If you get very specific about one thing, the readers will often assume that you have gone to that level of logic and exploration on everything. It's a cheap trick, but it works and it's great. The other thing that this does is hard magic can be great for creating characters that feel competent and reliable and intelligent and resourceful, because there, information is power and information is important. All of those characteristics rely on the use and discovery of information. So by tying the bits of information and the learning and understanding of a system to the setting and to the characters, you can highlight these aspects of both the world and the characters you put in your story. And both of those aspects feed directly into how they can make your reader feel, which they can lead to your reader feeling like they have a deeper understanding of the world and they can appreciate the characters. And if you do it right, which this is what Brandon Sanderson does so well, is he does it in a way that the readers feel smart right alongside the characters. And that's just a couple of the things that hard magic can do for you. Hard magic is also great for idea stories where it's all about a what-if question, because a what-if question then gives you license and gives narrative reasoning for why you need to explore all of these details. Something has gone wrong because a magic effect has happened. Why has it happened? What's it doing? How's it work? If that's the focus of their story, it's going to be very easy for you to delve into the details and make this a hard magic system. Vice versa. If you're really building a hard magic system, you can use that to support those types of stories. Okay, I can't avoid it any longer. I really need to address the elephant in the room. And that is the fact that hard magic does not have to be rational magic. It can be hard rational or hard and irrational. And neither of these is better than the other. Brandon Sanderson mostly does stuff in the hard rational quadrants, teetering more towards hard irrational in some of his systems. You have things that, like Marvel, are hard irrational, and you have more things that are hard rational, like Sympathy and the Kingkiller Chronicles. The point is, in this video, this is all about the amount of information and how to build a system that is designed in such a way that communicating large amounts of the information is easy and makes sense. Again, each type has its strengths and weaknesses. So if you're building your magic system and you're building a hard magic system, it doesn't have to feel rational. And what's more, through all of this, we're really talking about how the system is going to feel from the perspective of your readers, which is very important, because you can build an extremely hard rational system for you and then present it in the story in such a fashion that it feels like it's hard irrational, or even soft rational, or even soft and irrational. Lord of the Rings is a great example of that, where in theory, there's a lot of explanation about how the stuff works. And if we just had the information, it could be a harder, I don't think I would go so far as rational, but definitely a harder magic system. So please bear that in mind. Don't feel you have to go in a certain direction. There is value from every type of magic system. So with that in mind, that definition of how can we make it so it is a hard system where we are able to explain and provide knowledge on the entire magic system, with that in mind, let's start getting into these details. My first tip is to keep it simple. If you really want a hard magic system, one that you can quickly make a hard magic system in the minds of your readers, you need a relatively small packet of information that you can hand over to them. The less information there is to learn, the faster they can learn the majority of the system. Now, there's actually a lot of research and science about how much information the human mind can hold, especially in short-term memory. And that number usually tends to be around 5 to 8. Some people, it can go as high as 11, I think. But if you target that 5 to 8 range in terms of magical effects and patterns and really important rules, that is a great place to start, because very quickly you can communicate the majority, if not the entirety, of your magic system. Now, that 5 to 8 doesn't have to be absolutely everything. You can have some detailed rules and some nuanced applications and stuff like that that you introduce later, but the core, the essential information of your magic system, if you can keep it to those 5 to 8 points, it will be very easy for you to quickly develop a high level of understanding within your readers and within your magic users. Now, all of this is a spectrum, so you can play around with those amounts. You can get much higher in those numbers. I personally think that 15 to 18, especially if you were just looking at magical effects, is probably on the higher end. At that point, it's going to start to be more difficult for people to keep track of all of the individual pieces. So even if they have learned it all, it starts to get a little cumbersome and unwieldy. And I honestly think that's part of the problem that Brandon Sanderson ran into with the first Mistborn trilogy. That's why, in my opinion, I actually like the Wax and Wane series better, because he really narrowed down the possibilities. So when we were looking at any single character, really all we had to memorize were 2 powers. And even when you looked at the host of the main cast, we're now looking at 6 to 8. See? He had 2 for Wax, 2 for Wane, he had 1 for Marasi, and then a couple others that would fade in and out based on what they were dealing with. And it made it much easier to grasp and more interesting in terms of how they could then solve problems and how Sanderson himself could really explore the nuances of his magic system, because we didn't have to keep as much stuff on our mind all at the same time. I've got a couple more things that I want to discuss, but before we get to that, please take a minute, if you're enjoying the video, to like and subscribe. And if you're up for it, consider joining me on Patreon. If you join me on Patreon, you will get early access to my videos, to my newsletters. There's some exclusive content only available to different tiers of my patrons, and you can get discounts and sometimes free coaching sessions with me on your stories. So take a look at it. You can always follow, even if you don't become a full patron. Either way, I am just glad you're here, and any support you can provide is awesome. The next thing that you can do to help you build your hard magic systems is to keep it specific. So much of this hard-soft spectrum comes down to the amount of information there is and the amount of personal RAM, basically, personal brain power, we have to commit in order to keep all of the possibilities in mind. So the more specific you can make it, the less RAM gets used in order for people to be thinking about and processing the magic system and processing the situations in which you are using the magic. For example, I'm going to, especially when we're talking about hard magic and rational magic, which I want to do another video on, we're going to look at allomancy a lot. Now, with that, he could have just had general telekinesis, but he didn't. He specified. He took the broad concept of telekinesis and narrowed it down to push and pull. Not only push and pull directly toward and away from yourself. That was it. Greatly simplified. None of these odd vectors, none of these odd angles or anything like that. Very simple, very specific. Let's look at another example of how making it more specific can help it become more of a hard magic system. Maybe we have a magic system where the initial concept was magic users shaping physical matter. There's a lot that you can do with that. And if I just pitch that to you, there's so much that can encompass. You probably don't feel you have a solid grasp on the magic system in its entirety just yet. You would need a lot more information about these restrictions and the patterns and so on. Now, if I instead say that magic users can shape and manipulate flesh on bodies of people and animals, that narrows it down and that gives you a lot more information. And now just with this single piece of information, you probably feel like you have a much more complete picture of the magic system. But we can take it even further and say it's not just the control and manipulation of flesh. It is the controlling and manipulation of dead flesh. As we make it more specific, that single piece of information tells us more about the magic system as a whole. Just with that little bit, because of the restrictions and limitations that are bound into that statement, we now feel, at least when I'm talking about it, I feel like I have a much more complete picture of what the magic system is and what it can do. And that is what being specific with your effects can really do for you. A couple of things that can help you explore this specificity and narrow your focus is to really dig into the nuance and go for depth of understanding rather than breadth, and depth of understanding and capability rather than breadth. And this oftentimes comes from marrying magical effects with inbuilt restrictions and limitations, right? Just what we talked about with the flesh magic. We took it from being general matter, we could have then said organic matter, and then down to flesh, then down to dead flesh. Those are restrictions and limitations on what they can manipulate. And all of that is making it more specific so we can really do a deep dive into how all of this works. So when you're working with your magical effects, consider narrowing down. For example, I love elemental magic, and anybody who talks with me knows I love elemental magic. You could make fire magic a little more interesting if people only had control over fire in a specific temperature range, because that would change everything in terms of what they can do and how it can operate. And making your specifics based off of quantifiable and measurable facts will inherently lend it towards a rational system. Don't have to do that though. You can have it be irrational causes, right? Where rather than it being specifically dead flesh, we can just say that they can only control the flesh of specific types of creatures. There's not really any logic behind that as to why those creatures and not these others. So it's a illogical or irrational limitation, but doing that kind of deep dive and going narrower in focus will help with your specificity and in turn make it feel like a harder magic system. These next two tips are less about how you build the magic system and are more about how you present the magic system in your story. The first thing you can do, if you really want a hard magic system in your story, is introduce it early. Now, that's a good rule of thumb in general, because if you're doing fantasy of any kind or really any kind of genre fiction, you want to introduce the elements early so that the readers know what they're getting into. That's why if you're going to be doing kind of a slow burn to start, it's very useful to start with a prologue that puts the magic front and center so we know that they're going to end up dealing with this kind of stuff. With hard magic, though, you want to start providing the specific information that they need as early as possible. Don't info dump. Definitely don't info dump. But start providing the pieces. And that will help the readers come up to speed more quickly and get them to the state where it feels like a hard magic system to them faster. I'm going to be a bit nitpicky here because I love the Mistborn series, both series. I do think that is a weaker point in the first book, is we don't have any of the information about the magic system until Vin goes through her initial training with Kelsier, and then it's a huge info dump about almost all of the metals. And it's a lot of information to process, especially with how Brandon works his magic systems with the nuance and the implications that comes with all of it. There's a lot there. And I think if he had been able to start introducing the specifics earlier, it actually could have helped lead to that experience a little faster. He would have been able to get into some of those nuances and help us feel that hard, rational, mechanical magic system that he is so good at. We couldn't really feel that until after we got all of this information. And if he had been able to start feeding us some of that information earlier, I think that would have helped. Granted, the way he wrote this story, that wasn't necessarily feasible because he needed a situation where it made sense for all of these rules to be explained, which is another thing to bear in mind. Provide the information early, but make sure there is a reason in the context of the story that it is being provided. Very important. Another thing you can do is to have a character that either understands the entirety of the system or has to learn the entirety of the system. If they have to learn the entirety of the system, that works great if you want the reader to understand all of the system. But you can play around with this because the reader doesn't have to know absolutely all of the details to feel like they're dealing with a hard magic system. There's a lot of ways that you can sort of cheat and fuzz these lines a bit. Now, you still want the reader to know the majority of the information, but once they get past that into the realm of hard magic, knowing that there is somebody in the story that has the rest of the answers when they need it can sometimes be enough. It depends on how you implement it. This works really well when you have a mentor figure or if you have an extremely overpowered antagonist that the protagonists have to learn to deal with and overcome. That kind of stuff that just paints the picture that the information is there and we just need to get to it is a really tricky way of making it feel like a hard magic system before people actually get all of the information, which I think is super cool. I love playing around with narrative shenanigans and smoke and mirrors like this. Last, I just want to talk through a couple of quick examples to help you get a feel for what hard magic systems can look like. First and foremost, we obviously have allomancy, right? In the first book, through most of the first book, we think there's just the 10 metals and then the mythical 11th metal, which may or may not be an actual allomantic metal. 10 pieces of information, that's it. Even as we learn more about the system, there's only 16 base metals. There are some god metals, and there might be more than the 2 that we're familiar with, but 16 base metals is manageable, and that is a hard system once we learn all 16. Then there's Avatar: The Last Airbender, which I don't think I've talked much about on this channel yet. I personally think that it is a hard, irrational system, because at its core, it's very simple. Each person can control one element, except the Avatar, who can control all 4. Boom, that's done. Now, there are some nuances as we get into blood and lightning and metal, and some of those are logical extrapolations, some of them aren't, which is sort of what shifts it more to irrational. Like, you could get into the connection between fire and lightning, which I did in my own headcanon, because I argue that firebending is probably just the control of plasma, but they specifically said fire, and lightning is not actually fire. So there's a little bit of irrationality there. Plus the way they manipulate it, there's a lot of telekinesis and generation of material and generation of energy that doesn't ever really get covered or talked about a ton. So that all kinds of shifts it over. I think it can be very close to the line at times, but I do think it is more irrational than rational. Still a hard magic system because we know the 4 elements. Later, 7 and then eventually 8 specific effects of the 4 elements: lightning, metal, blood, and spirit. There you go. Another great example is the horror movie Alien, because the Alien itself is a hard magic system. There's not a ton to it, magically speaking. You have the different stages of life, and you have a couple of the different aspects, primarily being the acid blood. Facehugger, acid blood, and terrifying, terrifying creature. Beyond that, there's not a ton to learn, and you just kind of go from there, and horror ensues, and everybody has a good time, except for Ripley and the crew, and, well, basically anybody except the viewer. But that's horror for you. That's all for now, so again, take a second to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, check out my Patreon, and all of the other gobbledygook that always has to go into these videos. Still, just thank you for being here, and I hope this was useful. Let me know if there's information that you think I missed, or if you have further questions on any of this. But whatever you do, make sure that you keep writing and stay awesome.